Now the time has come for us to have a brief discussion of the presentations. What I will do is to make brief comments on Lyndon Lewis's presentation. I'd like to make an observation on Addington Coppin's presentation, but since we had Addy's tables rather and not the analytical part of his paper, it is difficult to be extensive, and Winston Griffith is going to comment on Rita Giacaloni's presentation. Now, I think there were some interesting points that came out in Lyndon Lewis's presentation. Looking at the developments, the recent developments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet model, and the shift both in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe to what people call the market model, which is not an automatic, which is not a straightforward process. We know that there are large numbers of people in those countries who are very hesitant and very skeptical about this process that these countries are embarking on. The interpretation one gives to this process really depends fundamentally on one's worldview, although it should depend in part on, if you will, a concrete reading of the evidence, right? But in these issues that were so ideologically charged, it is difficult very often for that very clear distinction to be made. But I think that Lyndon touched on a number of very important points in his presentation. And I recall in his delivery, he said that the developments of perestroika and glasnost in what was the Soviet Union at that time certainly had a major impact on developments both within that country as well as in the countries of Eastern Europe. And when you look beyond that to the countries of the National Liberation Revolution, indeed one sees impacts there. For example, in Angola and Mozambique, it was customary a couple years ago in 1990-91 for governments to say, hey, it is time for us to abandon what we were doing and follow the motion of global change. And a lot of people said, ha, we told you this thing couldn't work. And of course, I'm making this point because I want to come back to something else that Lyndon referred to. And that is, if it's that the problems in the Soviet Union were simply the result of the failures of the Brezhnev era and the Gorbachev period to follow the path of the Bolshevik Revolution. And there's a tendency for many people to make that argument and assume therein that what came in 1917 and the 1 or 2 decades following was some comprehensive articulation of a socialist path. And I think a critical review suggests that the Bolshevik Revolution brought a lot of the weight of the past with it, fundamentally. A lot of the weight of the past with it. And once we move away from asserting the claims of socialism to be the actualization of some socialist process, once we make that distinction, we can deal with the contradictions which Bolshevism brought. And those contradictions continued to deepen to the point where the model basically outlived its own effectiveness. And in a very concrete way, the fact that the law of value never stopped operating in the Soviet Union meant that they did not fully transcend the contradictions associated with the world market and capitalism, although the system was in some ways peripheral to the traditional norms of that world market. But the Soviet Union in that regard never had a world to pillage and rape like capitalism did for accumulation in the center, and therefore it suffered in some ways from that. And also the fact that on another note, it committed large amounts of resources in the post-war period in competition with the West for influence in the third world around the dynamics of realpolitik. Soviet Union, a global power, behaving like a global power in a lot of ways, and committed vast amounts of resources, and there was a tremendous neglect in the domestic sphere. But one of the problems we found was that in the Soviet Union, they produced a lot more commodities than was produced in the West, but at a much higher social cost. And then the other dynamic is what? The arms race. As you know, once you have produced a B2, it's a B2. It can be used to kill people, but it doesn't help you to expand value added and increase the output of commodities and skills and so on. So if you're trying to build a socialist economy and you're caught up in this global race where the resources that should be used for social transformation are allocated for a number of these other purposes, there are certain consequences. No one is saying that third world liberation movements did not benefit in any way from that association with the Soviet Union. But we've got to make a distinction between that and the concretization of socialism as a system. And I think that a number of these things were alluded to very clearly in Lyndon's presentation. And with respect to the Caribbean, as he clearly indicated, there are a number of peculiar circumstances in our experience in the region existing outside of the dynamic of the Soviet model and what it had to offer, so that the collapse of the Soviet Union in many ways reflect, and this is heretical, you know, the deepening contradictions of capitalism at the global level, right? The intensification of globalization and global restructuring brought home to bear to that system the limitations in that model. At every level, communications, telecommunications, information, the research and development, the ability to produce commodities to meet the needs of people within the society, as well as to trade in the global market to acquire foreign exchange for a number of things that would help them to avoid, as it were, reinventing the wheel. And if one makes the argument that these contradictions followed and haunted Bolshevism from the beginning up to the end, and that the concretization of socialism was not actually achieved, then you have to ask questions about what was the real essence of the Soviet model, right? Now Mandel says you can't call it socialism and you can't call it capitalism. And Samir Amin made basically the same statement. Some hybrid deformation, some atrophied process, as it were, there, not being fish nor fowl. Right? And if the fowl is socialism and it's not that, and if the fish is capitalism and it's not that, what are the features it articulates? And I would say that since the law of value continued to operate, and it was distribution not so much according to your need, but determined by a communist party, hegemonic in the state, and distributing the social goods not according to the broad needs of the masses, but according to certain other criteria. It leaves a host of unanswered questions to this very day. And these are some of the things I think we need to explore. Now, with respect to Addy, one point. I think that the argument Addy makes about integration through a free trade agreement with the United States and some of the implications there was a very telling point about whether Caribbean countries demonstrate or can demonstrate this capability to change the production structure, the skills mix, the competitiveness framework in order to improve qualitatively their position, right? And that if they continue to produce what they produce along the way they produce, the means by which they produce it, even if they produce more of it, it will not necessarily mean a qualitative transformation of their position. Am I interpreting this stuff?
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay. I think that was a very important point for him to make. And I will stop there and ask Winston to address Rita Giacaloni's presentation.
Right. In that it does not consider regional integration as some separate entity distinct from the principal actors. I think there's a tendency, tendency exists for us to think of these movements of having a dynamic in and of themselves, and we don't look at the actors behind the dynamic. And to Rita, the principal actors are the entrepreneurs and the government. And I agree with her implicit assumption that it is difficult to understand why the movement has faltered without understanding the role played by these principal actors. She asserts that Caribbean CARICOM has witnessed a revival since the mid-1980s, largely in part due to the departure of Dr. Williams from the political scene. I'm not sure why that is so, but nevertheless she makes that assertion. However, this assertion is not substantiated, except to cite certain measures which have been I think she might have used the word implemented now, which were not implemented before the departure of Dr. Williams. I'm not so sure that these things have been implemented. I think measures have been taken to implement them, but they have not been implemented. For example, SET has not been implemented. the removal of barriers to trade, that has not been implemented. Free movement of labor has not been implemented. So there's certain things that have not been implemented. Measures have been adopted at various heads of government conferences to implement them. So it's very important to remember that passing resolutions at heads of government conferences is quite different from implementing them. We know that many of these resolutions, for example, like the Grand ANSE resolution or the Kingston Declaration of 1990, I think, they have not yet been implemented. But what has been the role of the entrepreneurs in the period covered by Rita's paper, the post-Nassau period, the post-Nassau period, and the primary aim of the Nassau Accord, or aims of the Nassau Accord, were to move toward complete free trade and, let's say, a common external tariff. And I think so she also mentioned that the LDCs had to raise the value-added tax from 20 to 30%, something like that. We noticed that in Trinidad, as she pointed out, the Manufacturers Association opposed the Nassau Accord on the grounds that it might lead to a diminution of their domestic market share. Some years later, however, after prodding from the Trinidad Chamber of Commerce and from the Caribbean Association of Industry and Commerce, that association, the TTMA, Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association, supported the Nassau Accord. We see that Barbadian and Jamaican producers too supported the accord because they wished to gain access to the Trinidad market. Entrepreneurs in the LDCs, they also supported the accord for the same reason. However, they opposed SET and they also opposed VAT. Now, I think this is a very important point because it shows how integration movements are differing from early integration movements, if we may use the Caribbean as an example. In the early integration movements, it was the politicians. The politicians were the ones who were giving impetus to integration. Now, in the recent integration movements, or in the deepening of integration movements, as in the case of the European community, it is entrepreneurs who are coming forward and trying to expand the areas in which they are able to sell their products. And I think this is very important because what is quite clear is that national markets, or confining production to national markets, has become a barrier to accumulation. These guys are trying to deepen the area in which they operate or widen the areas in which they can operate. Another interesting point in Rita's paper is that governments tend to take the cue from entrepreneurs in support of regional matters, so that if entrepreneurs tend to view an activity as beneficial, governments will tend to promote that activity, or if it is harmful, they tend to oppose that. What we don't get from the paper, however, is what position governments will take if, let's say, you have a situation with labor and capital. If, let's say, labor is opposing that and capital is supporting it, what will be the position of government? If we may use the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, as an example, one will tend to think that government sides with capital because we see in the United States that the labor movement is opposed to NAFTA, but yet President Bush is quite interested in getting this agreement forward. We also see that in Canada, the Small Business Association, they are opposed to an extension of NAFTA, but we see that the Mulroney government, the Small Business Association, or the capitalists are supporting NAFTA. The unions and the labor movement, let's say, they are opposed to it, but yet Mulroney is pushing it forward. So it is quite clear that if you have a conflict between capital and labor, government, in many instances, tend to come down on the side of labor. Now, Rita's paper, however, raises some interesting questions. Can national entrepreneurs in the Caribbean strengthen the integration movement? Can they compete internationally? And I don't think she has addressed this, and it is very important that she addresses this, because if, let's say, the entrepreneurs are going to be the principal actors, if, let's say, they're the ones who are going to move this thing forward, one has to raise the question, can they strengthen the movement? I don't think they can. I think that most of the entrepreneurs in the Caribbean, I'm speaking of the indigenous entrepreneurs, are primarily merchants. And merchants make their living by buying and selling goods. They're not interested in transforming production processes. I mean, why is it advantageous, let's say, for a merchant in Barbados to engage, or let's say for the merchants in town to, let's say, get into agricultural production, producing food, when they can import the food, process and cans and so on from the United States, from wherever, just stack on, let's say, a 10% markup right to the product and sell it, instead of undergoing the risks of production. Those risks include marketing the product, you have pests, you have larceny, you have all sorts of water is a very important abundance of water. All of these are things risks which they have to undertake. Whereas let's say if they import the commodity, just add a markup, and they can make their profit. So they have some advantage in maintaining the status quo. Can they compete internationally? I doubt it very much. The one reason they cannot compete internationally is that they're not using the most up-to-date techniques. Some people believe that in the Caribbean, what we can do is to engage in what is called appropriate technology. And I don't know what they really mean by this. I surely would not wish to go into a hospital and hope that on the operating table with a brain tumor, and hope that the doctors are going to use appropriate technology, labor-intensive techniques on me. I'm looking for the best technique available to save my life. But this whole idea of appropriate technology is based on the assumption that we're dealing with closed economies. But what we notice is that Caribbean economies are becoming more and more open, whether they wish to or not. They're becoming more and more open, largely due to the influence of the IMF and the World Bank. And one must raise this question: can these countries compete in open markets when they're using this so-called appropriate technology, when at the same time you have goods in the more developed countries being produced by some of the most up-to-date techniques? This lady, I think her name was Graham, who's head of the Manufacturers Apparel Association in Jamaica, Small Business Manufacturers Association in Grenada. She made a very interesting comment some years ago, and she said, they don't buy from us. Well, why don't they buy from us? That is meaning the Jamaican people. Well, they can go up to Canada and get these goods much more expensive, Florida, get these goods, at a much cheaper price, less expensive, and they can bring them back and they can outcompete us in the local markets. So why do they buy from us, you see? So I'm very doubtful that the entrepreneurs can compete internationally, and therefore if they can't compete internationally, what you'll find is that income in the region will decline. And if income in the region is going to decline, what it means is that fewer goods will be bought within the region, so that the integration movement will tend to weaken. Some other questions ought to be addressed in Rita's paper. She talks about globalization, but she doesn't tell us what she means by the term, or what are its features, and how are these features different from earlier periods of globalization. Now, we talk of globalization as though it is something new. It may not necessarily be new. We know, for example, a writer in the 19th century, about the mid-19th century, said that all the peoples of the world are enmeshed in an international market, something like that. I think it goes like that. They're all enmeshed in an in markets which are becoming more and more international. So it is quite clear. So one may say that globalization is not new. I think globalization today has some features which are quite different from earlier periods of globalization, and I think Rita ought to address those. Now, another point which I would like to mention is that Rita may inadvertently give the impression that regional blocks, or I should say, regional blocks are only one aspect of globalization. Let me backtrack here. Regional blocks are only one aspect of globalization. But how will a regional bloc help Caribbean integration? I'm not sure that they will, unless Caribbean governments are willing to address the issue of global competitiveness, which gets back to technology. Okay? Good. Thanks.
Thank you.
My conclusions were that that's my conclusion.
Started there last time.
That integrative movements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and CBI are catalytic contributors to the region's efforts to attract export-oriented offshore operations. That the contribution of exports to the U.S. was, as I said, most of the time smaller than those of exports to other regions. That since, in the case of the CBI, the domestic environment was not altered significantly, then we need significant increases in volumes of exports, increases in capital investment, and improvements in the terms of trade for the region to benefit. Fourthly, that the Caribbean basin economies need to be more flexible in responding to changing market conditions. But more privatization would help the region to flourish, since these variables were largely exogenously determined. The influx of capital, foreign capital, and the improvements in the terms of trade were outside of the region's control. And that in the short run, which I've already discussed, there doesn't seem to be much that could take place if the region cannot adjust. However, in the long run, The North American Free Trade Agreement and other such initiatives must be more private sector oriented, and governments probably should allow the private sector to take the initiative in these and not get too involved. I believe that what might happen out of this is that the benefits of integration might show forth as resources become more mobile in the region, and that as the region's playing field becomes more level. And finally, that the region might find itself, due to external forces, coordinating its internal policies and therefore get whatever benefits can come from integration. And those are my conclusions.
I'd like to ask a question to Lyndon Lewis and then make a comment on Rita Giacalone's paper. The question is, do you think that just like it's happened in Europe, where part of the left has integrated itself to the green movement and backed the ecological problems and analysis of them and trying to find solutions, do you think in the Caribbean part of the left also will tend to identify with ecological problems, and to the extent that ecological problems are linked to massive tourism, whether that will be an issue? And the comment on Rita Giacalone is that although I might agree that statistically the number of resolutions that have been implemented after Nassau and Grenada might be higher than X years before, even though it's true that entrepreneurs are the driving force now behind progress in CARICOM, I certainly don't think that I had the feeling from her presentation that things were going well in CARICOM, that it was sort of in a revival, and frankly I think the situation is quite stagnant. There's a tremendous frustration to start with within the entrepreneurs as to the fact that it's not moving well. There's a tremendous amount of lack of political will in the English-speaking Caribbean to really improve CARICOM, and I don't think that came out from your comment.
First of all, one of the comments I would make would be particularly that I do not see merchants as Schumpeterian entrepreneurs. That I think you're dealing there with secondary sector actors. And I think it's terribly important to consider technological entrepreneurs, and particularly to make use of the Caribbean region's strong educational base as we get into an era of geography-free workstations to develop thinking factories, which can be done with quite low capital. That's just one point. Secondly, one of the things that can be done to encourage such entrepreneurs is the process of small business incubation. And that I have seen work quite well in the U.S. It has the great advantage of combining government aid with market testing at a very low initial capital cost. And I recommend that to you.
Do you have in mind third Italy? What goes on, what called third Italy?
Sorry?
Third Italy, that's what you have in mind?
Somewhat like third Italy, somewhat like what has been done in the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania in the U.S. following the decline of the commodity steel industry.
Okay.
I'm not even sure I can ask a question. I'm not an economist. It looked as though the numbers on the table were sort of a market basket of products that you were looking at in terms of determining the pluses and minuses of integration. And I wondered if you found some products that did better and some products that did worse, and you sort of came out with an average. And I'd like to see if you could respond to that.
My question goes back to the Soviet Union, and I wondered if we cannot look at the fact that the structure of the society into which supposedly communism, socialism was introduced was really feudal. The serfdom had been abolished, half a century before, and were they not trying to graft on a very modern idea of society on a decayed structure of feudalism? I thought maybe you'd like to explore that a bit.
I have a comment in terms of the role of the corporations and government. Up to this point, in terms of the free trades, it's really the governments have been doing the free trade agreements, but it's really very much co-opted by the corporations, by the transnational corporations. So at this point, the issue is not, it seems to me, is not how much corporations or private industry should take the lead in this, or governments, but how much the people should really have a say. And that, I think, is more reflected in the environmental issues and the issues that people have to get out of this, for example, of GATT. Right now, for example, in the community, the religious and the labor groups in Canada, the United States, and Mexico are getting together to try to see how this message gets to GATT. Because in GATT, many times the governments do their representation of the people, but it's really the representation of the corporations. So I think at this point it's very important to know how we can see the input directly from the people. The other comment that I had was in terms of the output. It seems that, for example, with the whole maquiladora system in Mexico, the output is not as great. And one of the problems that we have with the maquiladora system is that it doesn't have any relationship with local manufacturing, with Mexican production. So that the output then is not as great. Even we have so many maquilas throughout the country, still is not helping in terms of the output because of the lack of help or cooperation with the Mexican manufacturing, and also because there is actually in many cases no transfer of technology because of that lack of connectedness with the local manufacturing.
I just have a question regarding the issue of actors in the process of Caribbean integration. I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the push towards integration in the Caribbean in the mid-1980s and now has been a response to a process that began not in the Caribbean but in the US, especially CVI in the 80s and now with NAFTA. So the question is, shouldn't we be careful in saying that capital, local capital, or the local state is an actor in this process of promoting integration? Are they just responding to a process that is coming to them?
First of all, I think the integration process in America takes form again in '86 with the Mercosur, in reaction to the expansion of the European Common Market, which started up again in '82. And in relation to the actors, maybe this is an open question. I think, because there's a question here, if we have these entrepreneurs or industrialists existing already, national industrialists that exist already in the Caribbean, I guess you could say the same for certain parts of other parts of Latin America, or if somehow some interest groups are trying to create the environment so that this economic activity can go ahead. And so in this way, there's a combination of the political actors and some type of economic actors. Because we have to really then try to pinpoint who's pushing integration, and of course integration has been being pushed. And it could be that it's an environment that's trying to be created in which, of course, a group can become a stronger capitalist actors in some way.
We're going to give the three presenters an opportunity to respond, right? Briefly to the comments. I have a meeting at 4, so I'm going to leave at 4 o'clock, right? And there's another panel due in here at 4. So we must observe the 10-minute limit, right? So why don't we go in the order in which you had the presentations, Lyndon, Addington, and Rita.
Okay, your question was whether the Caribbean left will sort of integrate with other sort of social movements type groups just as a means of survival. And my response is that I think that the European left is a left with an older tradition and a more mature tradition, and a tradition which has challenged the paramountcy of the Soviet model for some time, and we had seen this in Eurocommunism and so on. And so they have been able to get into making the coalitions with other social movements at an earlier stage. Plus the ecology movement and the green movement has been around for some time, while in the Caribbean it is now emerging as a particular social force here. I think that some people will make the linkage. I think that others are going to go in different directions. I think that from some of the things that we've heard from the WPJ in Jamaica, that it might be open to that kind of coalition with other forces, other social forces. And certainly from my talk with people in the Workers' Party of Barbados, it suggests also to me that would be something. But I don't think that the ecological movement is that strong and that far advanced to think. But I would imagine that there are other social movements that those parties might be able to link up with. And I think you're right about the structure of the Soviet Union. I think this is part of what Hilborn was talking about when he talked about carrying the weight of the past on it. In fact, a number of the measures that were implemented by Gorbachev were described by Robert Tucker as the actions of a reforming czar, in which he says that what was needed was not to tinker with the system, but to transform the system. And part of that was the very contradictions under which he was liberating.
The first question related to my numbers. Were the numbers related to some sectors more so than to others? And I would say to the extent that some countries' sectors, that countries are different in terms of their structure, then the answer is yes. However, I did not disaggregate the data. I just took each country's gross aggregate output, aggregate exports. I deflated it by the export price index, and I took aggregate capital, however we measure that. I measure that using the investment to GDP ratio following other people. So I just it was a macroeconomic thing. And the disaggregation, to the extent there was disaggregation, is where I focused on manufacturing exports versus non-manufacturing exports. Otherwise, it was just all at a macro level. The next question I have here was an attempt to explain Mexico's insignificant exports in terms of the coefficients I had via a lack of technological transfer. I don't know if that is the answer, although it might be, largely because I do not think that in the rest of the region there was any technological transfer either, Central America and the Caribbean. Therefore, it is an interesting question, and I wonder what the answer is. I have a feeling that because capital usually comes along with the increased exports, then if you just eyeball what's happening, you would see increased exports. But when you try to disaggregate or to separate these two variables, we realize that the growth is coming from the increased capital more so than from the increased volumes of real exports. And that is what the statistics tell me. The next question relates to whether the state is an actor in the process or if it is just responding. My feeling is that the state is just responding and should just respond. I must confess that I'm more of a market-oriented economist than some of you. And I do believe that the private sector generally knows best. And when the private sector tells government, here are the things that we need done, that government should respond, because government is not about creating output, government is about creating equity. And if government sees that equity is about to be violated, then government should say, well, we don't want this to happen. But in terms of creating growth, the government does not create growth. Government does very little. All government can do is provide the infrastructure, correct the things that are wrong, from my perspective. But as far as growth is concerned, that's the private sector's job. Should we depend on domestic entrepreneurs or foreign entrepreneurs? Frankly, I don't care. I think that foreign entrepreneurs, to the extent that they give us an opportunity to earn incomes and to pull ourselves up are helping us just as much as domestic entrepreneurs. And the final question relates to interest groups.
Leave something for Rita.
Okay, I'm told that I should give way to Rita at this stage.
Okay. When Winston Griffith was speaking, he passed me a note saying you have a tough discussion, and I wrote back I like it, because I think he pointed out to lots of things that maybe I thought they were there, but they were not. So I thank you very much for your comments on the paper. And I will try to answer some of the questions, the one that I can have more clear now at this moment. For example, and I don't begin in any specific order, regarding the difference of if there is some kind of difference and we should be speaking about economic actors, I think my paper, my definition is that political actors are any group actor that has the power to affect decisions taken and implementation of decisions. It doesn't make much of a difference from this perspective if they get their power because they have the money or capital or because they have electoral strength in voting. The factor is that they influence power decisions and political decisions, and they are political actors. Okay. So I don't really make much of a difference regarding that. Now, to the point, I think over there, if these political actors are really important, if the decisions of CARICOM only are a kind of reaction towards the behavior of the international economy and the formation of blocs outside, I accept it here in the paper. And I even said it, I mean, given the importance of the formation of these blocks, of the fact that economy is changing, regardless what the Caribbean is doing or not doing, I think that the change in the attitude of regional entrepreneurs, especially those of the more developed nations, also helps to explain why these decisions were taken and that more of these were implemented. And I think that this point is important because it may have internal repercussions. I accept that the main, let's say, the driving force behind entrepreneurs and all the political actors of the Caribbean is the fact that the economy is moving. And if they don't move, even following the trend, they will stay out, and they cannot. Now, relatively reactivation of CARICOM, I would say, in these 6 or 7 years comparing to the 15 before. Now, I think there is also maybe a subtle or not so subtle change in the way the actors are behaving. For example, of course, if politicians or heads of government do not accept the measures, they are still there, and entrepreneurs are not all that powerful to implement decisions. But on the other hand, if you look at the way the stock market was decided and formed and established in a record time for CARICOM decisions and implementation, I mean, it came from CAIC, the proposal. The entrepreneurs went to the meeting and discussed it there, and not even say we want a stock market with such and such countries participating. They explained the rules of the game, how it should be organized. I mean, they went to the internal organization to make it function, and the stock market went into operation in a year and some months, explicitly, I mean, the way the entrepreneurs had told CARICOM heads of government how it should be operated. And it's functioning. And it's the first word to establish the movement of capital, even if it's among 3 countries, Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica. And I think that was practically impossible to think about that in the 70s. So even if there is a relatively reactivation, I think is an important step. Also, another important fact of CARICOM was that decisions still have to be taken by consensus. But nowadays, whenever decisions are taken, the countries or the governments that decide to implement a measure like SET, as there are some countries that have implemented it, go ahead. And they cannot leave the others behind, something that was not done before. And now even entrepreneurs are calling for the end of consensus, of the rule of consensus. And they want more institutional, organized voice within the organization, within CARICOM itself. So I think there are more things changing, even if not everything is implemented. Now, what governments will do if the interests of entrepreneurs contradict those of labor? I'm pretty sure they will side with entrepreneurs. I'm sorry.
Okay, we have run out of time, and we'd like to thank the audience for its patience and support.